During the late summer and fall of 1863, three hilltop earthworks forts were built on separate, prominent hills south of the town Knoxville, Tennessee, across the Holston River, now called the Tennessee River. These forts were built parallel to the river and were constructed under the direction of Captain Orlando M. Poe of the Army of the Ohio. From east to west, these forts were Fort Stanley, Fort Dickerson, and Fort Higley, each named in honor of a Union officer who died in battle against Confederate forces in eastern Tennessee. Fort Dickerson was named in honor of Captain Jonathan Calvin Dickerson of Company B, 112th Regiment, Illinois Volunteer Infantry, who was killed in action just south of the village of Cleveland, Tennessee, September 18, 1863. Much has been lost over time. However, research and records can reconstruct his life fairly well. This is his story. Jonathan Dickerson was born May 8, 1832 to Benjamin J. Dickerson and Elizabeth Magdalena Dickerson, Schaefer, her maiden name, near the village of Shawangunk, Ulster County, New York. According to census records, Jonathan had an elder brother, Matthew C. Dickerson, who was born in 1823, and an elder sister, Ann Elizabeth Dickerson, who was born in 1826. Jonathan's mother took him across the county line to the Dutch Reformed Church in New Prospect Township, Orange County, New York, for christening when he was an infant. Census records of 1850 suggest that Jonathan had left home and was working as a farmhand for John and Arabella Bailey in Cantor Township, Tioga County, New York, at the age of 18. Jonathan's father, Benjamin, died in August 1857 at the age of 65 years. By 1860, census records show Jonathan and his mother were living with Jonathan H. Du Bois and his wife, Ann Elizabeth, Jonathan's elder sister, and the Du Bois' three children in Penn Township, Stark County, Illinois. Jonathan was 28 years of age at the time. On July 2, 1862, President Lincoln called for 300,000 volunteers to join in the fight against the Confederacy with a 3-year enlistment. Lincoln then made an additional plea on August 4th for an additional 300,000 men to serve for 9 months unless discharged sooner. Jonathan answered the call to arms on Lincoln's second plea. Hundreds of Illinois residents from Stark and Henry counties assembled at Galva, Henry County, Illinois to enlist. By a vote of the assembled, the following men were selected as officers of Company B, 112th Regiment, Illinois Volunteer Infantry on August 12, 1862. James B. Doyle, Captain, Jonathan C. Dickerson, First Lieutenant, and John Gudgel, Second Lieutenant. The regiment was ordered to muster at Peoria, Illinois. By the 18th of September, 1862, all 10 companies of the 112th had assembled, a force of 940 officers and enlisted men. Here the officers and men were issued uniforms, canteens, haversacks, rations, arms, and ammunition. There was little time for formal training. However, the officers did receive basic training in battle tactics. Many enlisted men headed into battle with little more than personal hunting and foraging skills. No known pictures of Jonathan Dickerson exist. However, we do know from his muster records that he was 5'7.5" inches tall, with brown hair, blue eyes, light complexion, and single. A carpenter by trade, age 30 years. On October 8th, the regiment boarded rail cars at Peoria, bound for Cincinnati, Ohio, arriving there at midnight October 10th. The regiment left the train and immediately marched across the Ohio River on a pontoon bridge to Covington, Kentucky. The 112th, under the command of Colonel Thomas J. Henderson, reported to Major General Gordon Granger at 2 a.m. on the morning of October 11th. On October 24th, the 112th was ordered to winter quarters at Camp Ella Bishop near Lexington, Kentucky, where it was stationed with the 45th Ohio and 18th and 22nd Michigan Regiments. On March 31st, Captain James B. Doyle of Company B resigned his commission. First Lieutenant Jonathan Dickerson was thereby promoted to captain, Second Lieutenant John Gudgel to First Lieutenant, and First Sergeant B.F. Thompson to Second Lieutenant. The 112th was stationed in Somerset, Kentucky from approximately May 15th until July 8, 1863. During this time, Jonathan was granted leave to marry Cornelia Hasbrook Deo on May 28, 1863, in Henry Township, Marshall County, Illinois. Cornelia gave birth to a son she named Calvin in February 1864. Jonathan was never to see his son. The 112th then made its way to East Tennessee, with minor skirmishes throughout. Athens, Tennessee became a camp for the 112th after many miles of riding. After some time, it was decided that a move farther south to hold rail and road junctions near Cleveland would be vital to limit Confederate supply and troop movements northward. On September 15, 1863, Dickerson, Gudgel, and their men were ordered to Cleveland, Tennessee to watch and report on Confederate troop movements. Cleveland was the gateway between Georgia and East Tennessee, through which enemy troops would have to pass to attack Union General Burnside's army in Knoxville. This was also the junction of the Dalton and the Chattanooga Railroad branches, a major supply line. The 112th and Dickerson arrived in Cleveland around midnight and met no enemy resistance. They established pickets just south of town and set up camp in the courthouse square in the downtown area. Small groups of rebel cavalry were spotted on the 16th but were driven away. It seemed shots were exchanged, but no reports of casualties were found. The Union had the upper hand at the time. Reports from the 17th indicated that a large rebel force was approaching via the Dalton, Georgia road. The Union forces prepared for an attack that never came to be that day. On the morning of the 18th, Dickerson and 25 men rode south along the Dalton Road to recon for rebels. Lieutenant Gudgel and 20 men rode south down the Chattanooga Road. There was and still is a fork in the road which one can see readily in the following pictures. These modern pictures seem very consistent with descriptions of the conflict back in September 1863. Gudgel and his men had barely passed the Union pickets when the rebels, with a much larger force, advanced quickly with the intent to overwhelm and occupy Cleveland. Gudgel and his men started their retreat back to town while exchanging gunfire. Dickerson and his men, upon hearing the shots, set out across the fields to reinforce Gudgel. Dickerson and his men had made little progress when he heard Union pickets firing from the road he had just left. He and his men turned around and rode back to the Dalton Road, as Gudgel was defending the other road. A rebel force had already stormed into town before Dickerson reached the Dalton Road. However, Dickerson was able to capture an ambulance, an old Henry Express wagon, a surgeon, and 15 men acting as rear guard. They kept riding up the road toward Cleveland, prisoners in tow. They halted near the forks in the road, and Dickerson ordered 3 men to ride back down the Dalton Road to look for more enemy troops. The men returned only a few minutes later to report a force of about 400 men were approaching. Captain Dickerson exclaimed, "We'll give them a fight anyhow! Forward!" They then rushed the rebels at full gallop. The enemy quickly dismounted upon sight of the Union soldiers and took cover in the edge of some small timber, which left Dickerson little choice but to take position in an open field, forming his men into a skirmish line about 30 feet apart. With his prisoners in the rear, they proceeded to open fire upon the rebel force. Dickerson rode forward and, while mounted on his horse, emptied 2 revolvers into the rebel line. As he attempted to dismount, his left foot still in the stirrup, he was struck by a musket ball on the left side of his abdomen. At the same time, his horse jumped quickly to one side, throwing him to the ground. He tried to rise, and one of his men, not knowing he was wounded, tried to assist Dickerson up and offered him his horse. Dickerson replied, "I am shot, boys. Give them hell," and let out one last gasp and perished. Dickerson's men, now without a leader, retreated and rode toward town. The rebels were in quick pursuit, and they met another rebel force coming from the town to investigate the shots. Dickerson's men dismounted and took cover in a deep ditch along the road, exchanging fire, but eventually surrendered. One man, Clark M. Stuyvesant, was able to conceal himself in some brush and eventually escaped after the rebels had passed. He made his way up this hill, and after a few days of walking and foraging, eventually rejoined Union forces in Athens, Tennessee. The remaining Union troops were taken as prisoners of war and marched to Dalton, Georgia. Some Union troops escaped, but the records are unclear and specifics are difficult to determine. A few accounts state that from the first shot to ceasefire was approximately 10 minutes, perhaps slightly longer. Events happened very quickly, and only through recorded recollection can we slow them down to point out details. Captain Dickerson was the first officer killed from the 112th. He met his death 1 year to the day, and at the same hour of the day, from the time he left Bradford, Illinois, to rendezvous with his company in Peoria. He was popular with the officers and men in his regiment and was mourned by many. He was a brave, daring leader, an honorable and conscientious officer, and a generous man of noble heart, according to personal accounts of fellow soldiers. He had previously declared that he would never surrender to a rebel, that he would fight to the death rather than be captured, and in this, as in all things else, he kept his word. In January 1864, by order of General Burnside, the fortifications to protect Knoxville were named after fallen officers. Fort Dickerson, in honor of Captain Jonathan Dickerson's bravery, was thusly named. He was buried at Fort Hill Cemetery in Cleveland, not far from the site of the battle. After the war, a fitting monument was erected to his memory by his widow. Jonathan's widow, Cornelia, went on to file pension claims and eventually married George Parsons. The Parson family, George, Cornelia, and son, Calvin Dickerson, seemed to stay in the area according to 1880 census records. According to this 1900 census record, Calvin had 4 daughters and a son. By this time, Cornelia was living with Calvin for unknown reasons. Cornelia died on or about November 13, 1931, and is interred in a Bradford, Illinois cemetery. No photos of her headstone could be found online. This is a picture of the cemetery where she rests today. From there, records are scarce. However, records indicate that direct relatives moved to Texas at some point. Phone calls to likely descendants in Texas led to dead ends as well. If anyone has information about his descendants, please notify me. The goal of this presentation is to share this man's life as accurately as possible. He has a fort named after him in the city in which I live. This is his story, and I have tried to share it with the utmost care and accuracy. More information can be found in the links provided in the video description.